my dear students, so I am back with the third video of the video series on our environment class 10th science, and in today's video we are going to cover the flow of energy in an ecosystem or in a food chain. How does energy flow? Now that's very crucial. Now while we discuss that, we will talk about the Lindeman's law, which is a very important law. Not just that, we will also touch upon food web and biological magnification. So these are some of the areas which we will discuss in today's video. So I am Roshni from Learner Hub, the free learning platform where you can learn anything, anytime, from anywhere, absolutely for free at learnerhub.com. So are we all ready? Let's get started. So far we saw how organisms are dependent on one another for food. Now when I talk of food, it becomes very obvious to talk about energy, because why do we eat food? We eat food because of energy, as we need energy to do work. Right? So the consumption of food is in order to get energy. So let us look at the flow of energy in a food chain. So how the energy flows from one level to another level as the organisms consumes one another. Right? So let us look at these examples. Now what happens when a herbivore feed on the producers, that is the plants? Let us take an example. So maybe when I talk about the producers, that is the plants, so how do these plants get energy? By the process of photosynthesis, right? So in photosynthesis, what do? They utilize the energy of sun, that is they utilize the solar energy, and in presence of this solar energy, they convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose, and then they store it in the form of starch, and that is how they prepare food. So basically they are getting energy from solar energy. Now, can you guess how much percentage of the solar energy is actually getting converted into food? It is just 1% of solar energy which actually gets converted into food. So during the process of photosynthesis, it is just 1%. Just think how less it is. So if this is the sun, so now, just to give you an estimation, let us suppose that 10,000 units of solar energy is coming in. Now, plants will perform photosynthesis and prepare food. So, how much energy will this plant have after performing photosynthesis? It will have just 1% of this 10,000. So, 1% of this 10,000 would be nothing but 100 units. So this plant will have 100 units of energy with it. Now what do you think would happen when the primary consumer feeds on this plant? Who is a primary consumer? This is nothing but a herbivore, an animal which directly feed on plants. So when this grasshopper will eat this plant, do you think that this entire 100 units of energy will come to the grasshopper? No. Because when the grasshopper feeds on this plant, a good amount of energy will be lost as heat energy, because we know that whenever the transformation of energy takes place, whenever energy tries to transform from one form to another, a good amount of it is lost as heat. Some part of the energy will be utilized by the grasshopper during digestion. Some energy will be utilized for performing different activities. Whatever the grasshopper will fly, it will do some work. So in that also some energy will get consumed. So it will keep on losing some energy that way. So finally, how much energy will be left with this grasshopper? 10% of the producer's energy is turned into its body. So that means 10% of the producer's energy, that means the energy which was there in the plant, only 10% of this energy will actually be there inside the body of the primary consumer, that is grasshopper. So 10% of 100 would be 10. Right? So only 10 units of energy will be there in the grasshopper. Now similarly, when the secondary consumer, that is the frog, will consume the grasshopper, in that case what will happen? The similar thing will happen. So when the frog is also consuming the grasshopper, so much of energy will get spent in the digestion process, as well as so many other processes, the metabolic processes which keep happening inside the body of an animal. Some energy will be lost as heat, heat. So similarly, in this case also, only 10% of the primary consumer's energy will turn into the body of the secondary consumer. That means 10% of this energy. So 10% of this energy is just 1 unit of energy. So you just see, as the level in the food chain keeps on increasing, the amount of energy which is actually coming to that animal is decreasing. Right? So if you go to the even that higher level, that is the tertiary consumer, which is the snake here, in that case, how much energy will come here? Again 10%. So 10% of this 1 unit is nothing but 0.1 unit. Right? So now if you have another level as well, maybe if you have a quaternary consumer as well, which can be a hawk. So how much energy will go to that hawk's body? It will be 10% of this 0.1 unit. So it will be 0.01 unit of energy. So now are you able to understand that if the number of levels in a food chain is too many, then what is actually seen is that the highest level in that food chain will hardly get any energy, because as the level keeps increasing, the amount of energy that comes to that organism keeps on decreasing. Right? So therefore we will see that most of the food chains which actually exist inside an ecosystem generally consist of 3 to 4 levels. They do not have more than that. They do not have 10 levels or 9 levels, because then you will have hardly any energy left to be transferred to the higher level of organisms. Right? So this is how the energy flow actually takes place in a food chain. It is always the 10% of the previous level's energy that will actually get transferred to a trophic level. Right? Okay. So from this was derived the Lindeman's 10% law. By now you would have known that what is this 10% law. This states that only 10% of food energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next higher trophic level in a food chain. That means whatever energy the plant has, only 10% of it will go to the grasshopper. Again, whatever energy the grasshopper has, only 10% of it will go to the frog. Again, 10% of it goes to the snake, and the 10% of it finally goes to the hawk. And that is why it is never preferred to have too many levels in a food chain. So energy decreases as the trophic level increases. Therefore, food chains will generally consist of 3 to 4 levels. Also, it is seen that the number of organisms at lower levels is more. So if you see, when you talk about the plants, that is the producers, the number of plants are too many. There will be too many plants, because the dependency of on plants is too much. Right? Because there are so many other organisms which are dependent on plants. So the number of producers would be the highest. Then comes the primary consumer, that is the grasshoppers. So the number of grasshoppers will be little lesser than the plants. When you go to the even higher level, that is frogs, so the number of frogs will be little lesser. So when you go to snakes, they are even little lesser. Why is it so? Because lesser amount of energy is available to the higher levels. So when you don't have much energy, you will not have much organisms, right? Because every organism will need some more energy. Now you might say, now whenever you talk about higher organisms, for example, a grasshopper, maybe it will feed on a small amount of plants. Now when I talk of a frog, maybe the frog will feed on some 5 to 6 grasshoppers at a time, because the amount of energy which it will get from each grasshopper is not going to be enough for it. So it will consume some 5 to 6 grasshoppers. Similarly, when you talk about snakes, they will also consume multiple number of frogs. Right? So since it continues in that fashion, because the amount of energy that is available to the higher levels are comparatively lesser, therefore the number of organisms or the population of the higher levels are also lesser when compared to the lower levels. So we have more number of organisms at the lower levels as compared to the higher levels. So let us look at the energy pyramid, that is the flow of energy. What do we conclude from our discussion about the flow of energy? We saw that the energy flow is unidirectional. That means it can flow only in one direction. Uni means one. So here we saw that the energy flow happens from plants to the primary consumer, from primary consumer to secondary consumer, from secondary consumer to tertiary consumer. Do you think that the flow of energy can happen in the other direction as well? Now the goat gets its energy from the plants because it feeds on the plants. So is there any way by which the energy from the goat can be transferred back to the plants? No, because the plants cannot feed on the goats, right? Or the goats cannot feed on a jackal, or a jackal cannot eat up a lion. So the reverse thing is not at all possible, and that is why the flow of energy is also not possible in the reverse direction. So we say that the energy flow in a food chain is unidirectional. So it will always flow from the lower trophic levels towards the higher trophic levels. And what is the other conclusion from this discussion? That is called biological magnification. So you might be wondering, what is this new term now? So let us see what it is. It is nothing but progressive accumulation of chemicals at each trophic level. So here we saw that since the food which any of the living organisms existing on this earth eats is in some or the other way related to one another, right? Whatever we eat either comes directly from plants or from any of the animals which directly or indirectly feed on plants, right? So things are related. So our food are all related. Now in these food, sometimes harmful chemicals can also enter. Harmful, poisonous things can also enter the food chain. So now the question is, how can these things enter? For example, let me give you an example. Let us suppose there are many pesticides and insecticides which we use in the fields for improvement in crop yield, right? Now these chemicals, where do they go? They remain in the soil, or these chemicals get washed away with water. So they remain either in water or in soil. So from that soil, they can very easily enter into the plants. Now once they entered the plants, something which has entered plants have actually entered the food chain, because plants are the producers. So all living organisms depend on plants directly or indirectly. So something which has entered into plants means it has entered into the food chain. Now it is seen that these harmful chemicals, if it enters into the food chain, when it passes from one organism to another, as it goes higher in the trophic levels, the amount of chemicals or the concentration of chemical keep increasing. Like we have seen that as the trophic levels increases, the amount of energy transfer decreases. So in a similar fashion, here in this case, the amount of harmful chemicals keep increasing. Why? Because chemicals are something which are not degradable. That means there is nothing that can break down chemicals into simpler form which can be absorbed by an organism, right? So it remains unabsorbed. And that is why it keeps accumulating. So the higher the trophic level, the greater is the concentration of chemicals. Even though the amount of energy flow decreases, but the concentration of chemicals increases. Let us look at an example. You would have seen that in the soil, as I said, in the soil you will find many harmful pesticides, insecticides or chemicals. You would have heard of DDT. Right? So this DDT is a chemical which is generally found in the soil, because this is also used for the purpose of crop improvement and increasing soil fertility and all those stuff. So now suppose if this is the soil and you have DDT present here. Now here you see in the soil you generally see earthworms. Earthworms are very common in soil. So here also you can see this earthworm. So now this earthworm feeds on this soil. So what happens? That DDT enters into the earthworm. Now let us suppose that the concentration of DDT in the soil was very less. It was not that too much heavy amounts of DDT was present. It was maybe very less amount of DDT was present. Say for example, the amount of DDT present in the soil was 10 ppm. What is ppm? It is particle per million. That means for 1 million particles of soil, only 1 particle of DDT, only 10 particles of DDT was present. That is called particle per million. So that means 10 particles of DDT was present in 1 million particles of soil. So it is a very low concentration. Now when this soil is fed upon by the earthworm, what happens? It was seen that the concentration of DDT inside the earthworm was around 85 ppm. So it increased. Now the question is how? Because DDT is something which doesn't get degraded. It cannot be decomposed into simpler forms which can be absorbed by the earthworm. So it doesn't get broken down into simpler form. So it will remain as it is. Now when the earthworm feeds on the soil, it will feed good quantity of soil, and that good quantity of soil will have a lot of DDT. So the concentration of DDT inside the body of the earthworm will increase. Now this earthworm in turn will be eaten by some bird. So when this bird eats up this earthworm, it is seen that the concentration of DDT inside the body of this bird reaches to around 250 ppm, because this bird is not going to eat just one earthworm, because I told you the concentration as 85 ppm in one earthworm, but the bird is going to eat maybe some 10 or 20 earthworms. So it is going to eat many earthworms. Therefore, the concentration of DDT is going to multiply inside the body of the bird. Now, when we started, so here, what is my food chain? So if you look at the food chain here, in the soil it was very less, then it was the earthworm, and then it was the bird. And the concentration earlier was 10, which is considered to be very less and which is not lethal. It will not kill a person. But when it reached 85, even that was okay. But when it reached 250, it became lethal for the bird and the bird dies. So that means if you have a food chain with too many trophic levels, then there are two disadvantages. One is that if by chance any harmful chemical or acid enters the food chain, its effects will be worse at the higher levels. So if you have more number of levels, the effect is going to be worst at the higher levels. And the second disadvantage is that as the number of levels increases, as you go higher in the trophic level, the amount of energy that is actually getting transferred to that level becomes very less. So there is very less energy available for the higher levels. So because of such reasons, we generally see food chains consisting of 3 to 4 levels only. Now, in a similar fashion, we also observe, so this phenomenon is known as biological magnification. Magnification, the word magnify means to amplify, to increase. So that is why this is defined as progressive accumulation of chemicals at each trophic level. That means with each trophic level, the accumulation increases. That is why it is a progressive accumulation. So we also see biological magnification in the grains, pulses, vegetables which we eat. So whichever things we eat, these days for everything they will put insecticides, right? So you would have generally seen that your parents would advise you to wash fruits before you eat, wash vegetables before you cook them. So why do we want things to be washed? Why do we want these vegetables to be boiled and cooked properly? So that we can get rid of the maximum amount of the undesirable things which are present in those objects. However, these means also can't remove them completely. Sometimes they still have some amount of pesticide or some amount of undesirable substances. So we consume food just like that. So now the concentration of those harmful substances as we consume them, like for example, grains, when I talk about grains or pulses, when you prepare pulse, is it just one grain of a pulse you prepare or you consume? No, right? You just take one bowl full of the pulses. So you have so many pulses there, right? So when the food actually goes inside our body, the concentration of those pesticides or those harmful chemicals also increase. That is why it is always advisable to wash, boil and cook things properly before we eat. So this was all about biological magnification. I think with this I have completed my discussion on food chains. So what did we cover so far? We have talked about ecosystem, we have talked about the biotic components of ecosystem and the non-biotic and the abiotic components. We have further talked about the biotic components, wherein we talked about the different types of biotic components, producers, consumers and decomposers, and the food chain. So let us now talk about another concept which is called as food web. So when I say chain, it was a straight line. When I say web, what comes to your mind when you hear the word web? So generally we think of a spider web, right? You would have seen that net-like structure or the web which is prepared by a spider. So it is a hodgepodge net-like structure, right? So let us see, what is a food web? It is nothing but interconnected food chains forming a web-like pattern. So here you can see it is not a straight line at all. Here you can see different organisms eating up different other organisms. It is not that one organism can be eaten up only by one other organism. For example, when you take the example of plants, so how many animals are there which can feed on plants? I mean, how many herbivores are there? There are many. You can think of a deer, you can think of a rabbit, you can think of a goat, you can think of a cow, a buffalo. So there are so many animals which can feed on plants. Similarly, when you think of a rabbit, there are so many other animals which can feed on a rabbit, right? Similarly, when you talk of the goat, there are so many other animals which can feed on the goat. A tiger can feed on a goat, a lion can feed on a goat, right? So there are many animals which can eat up a particular animal, and that is how the food chains get connected and they can form a web-like structure, and this is known as a food web. So here you can see the example of a food web. So here you see different types of plants. They are eaten by animals like rabbit, squirrel, insects, right? Now these in turn are eaten by frogs, birds, bigger birds, cats. So now when you look at this frog can be eaten up by a snake. This can also be eaten by this bigger bird, right? So the same animal can be eaten up by two different animals. Now this animal in turn can be eaten up by this tiger, and this snake in turn can be eaten up by this hawk, or it can also be eaten up by this peacock. So now you see what gives rise to food web? The fact that one living organism can be eaten up by multiple living organisms give rise to a food web. So these are nothing but interconnected food chains, because if you look at only this chain, this is a straight chain, right? So it is a food chain. Similarly, when you look at this straight chain, this is again a food chain. So this line actually connects these two food chains. So why did this line arise? Because one organism, that is this frog, can be eaten up by two organisms, that is the snake and this bird, right? So food webs are nothing but interconnected food chains. They arise because of the fact that one organism can be consumed by multiple living organisms. So with this we have concluded, we saw that how living organisms, that is how the biotic components in an ecosystem depend on one another for obtaining their food. But that doesn't mean that it is only the biotic components which play a role in the ecosystem. The abiotic components are also equally important, because if the abiotic components do not exist, the ecosystem will not be able to exist. So let us quickly look at how the abiotic and biotic components depend on each other. So far we have discussed about these biotic components, that is the living organisms. So we saw that these living organisms depend on one another for obtaining their food. But do you think that food is the only thing that an organism needs to survive? If you get food, is that enough for your survival? There are plenty of other things as well which we need for our survival. And for that we need the abiotic components. Do you think that we can survive without water? No, right? And did you find any way to obtain water from the biotic components? No. So for water we are dependent on the abiotic components. Similarly, do you think we can survive if there is no air? If there is no air, then there is no oxygen, no carbon dioxide. So we cannot breathe in. Without breathing, will we be able to survive? Because when we breathe in oxygen, that actually makes respiration to happen. If there is no respiration inside the cells, there is no cell growth and the organism is not going to be alive, right? So water, air, soil, these are some of the things which actually are needed by any living organism for the various metabolic processes which take place inside our body. They also need all these things for processes like growth and reproduction. So not only these animals, every animal starting from the microorganisms or the birds or the variety of insects, all of them not only need other living organisms but also the abiotic components for their survival. So this is how the biotic and abiotic components interact with each other and survive and form an ecosystem. And many such ecosystems exist in our environment.
I hope you found this video useful. If you have a feedback or you want to share your experience with us, do let us know in the comment section, and I will see you all very soon with a new video, with a new topic. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.